Good afternoon. My name is Dan Snyder. I'm the Associate Director for Research here at the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. And welcome to a very special seminar of the Korea program here at Shorenstein A Park. This was scheduled to allow our scholars here to be able to comment and analyze the results of a very important event in Korea, namely the special election that was held on May 9th for the presidency of the Republic of Korea following the impeachment and resignation of President Park Geun-hye. Has been months of a unusual and important exercise in democracy in Korea, involving mass demonstrations and lots of people on the street, as well as the following of the constitutional procedures by both the National Assembly and by the Constitutional Court. And perhaps Americans will want to study the processes of democracy in Korea to see what lessons we might learn. But for the moment, we're going to try and look at the political and the economic and the foreign policy implications of the elections. Before I introduce our speakers, I do want to make an announcement, which is that the Korea program has a very important prize for writing in Korean studies, which recognizes and rewards outstanding examples of writing in an essay, term paper, or thesis produced during the current academic year in any discipline within the area of Korean studies, very broadly defined. It's a competition open to both undergraduate and graduate students. The prize is awarded in a special ceremony in the fall. And the application deadline for this is May 31st of 2017. So hence I'm encouraging those who might want to participate in this competition to do so urgently. So we're going to proceed in this order. Our first speaker, and I can't think of a more expert person to talk about this, who will look at the sort of domestic politics aspects of the Korean elections, of course, our own director of APARC, Professor Gi-wook Shin, who's also the head of the Korean Studies program. And in my experience, besides everything else, besides being a professor of sociology and the author of numerous works, he's about the best forecaster and analyst of Korean politics that I know. I can say that in every conversation I've ever had with him, I've had many about Korean politics, his track record is really good. And if he ever wanted to convert himself into a risk analysis firm for Korea, he would be doing pretty well. He'd make a lot of money.
I'm not making any money.
But he's doing this all for free for our education, and so he'll start us off. He'll be followed by Professor Young-Suk Lee, who's the SK Center Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute and the Deputy Director of the Korea program here at Shorenstein A Park. He's an economist whose work has been looked at issues of entrepreneurship and management, globalization, inequality, and Korea in the context of East Asian economies. Before coming here to Stanford, he was the assistant professor of economics at Williams College, and he will be looking again at the economic dimensions of this. Last but not least is the William J. Perry Fellow here at Shorenstein A Park, Ambassador Kathleen Stevens, who started her professional life as a Peace Corps volunteer. I can call that professional life. Peace Corps volunteer in Korea, and had two very important tours of duty in Korea during a long, more than 30-year career in the Foreign Service of the United States. One in the late 80s, at a time that our paths crossed, when we saw a very important earlier exercise in democratization in Korea, the end of the military regime and the advent of full democratic rule in Korea, and secondly, more importantly, more recently as the U.S. ambassador to Seoul. And she's going to talk about the foreign policy implications of the election. So, and as usual, after everyone speaks, there should be time for some discussion and questions from the audience. So, question.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Okay, so I'll try to share my takes on the election maybe for 10 minutes or so. As you know, this was a very unusual election. I mean, normally, presidential election in Korea takes place in December, like mid-December, when it's very cold. But this time it occurred after impeachment. So it happened on May 9th, right? May 9th. But then in terms of outcome, there was not any real surprise because Moon Jae-in was expected to win the election, and then in fact he did. He gained 41% of the votes, and obviously it's not more than half, but this was a five-way competition. So in that sense, you could almost say that it's a landslide because the runner-up had only 24%. So there was a substantial difference between Moon and the second person, who's Mr. Hong, a conservative candidate. So this time, after impeachment, conservatives were really at disarray, and they were really badly defeated. So in a sense, it's about almost opposite to what happened 10 years ago after Roh Moo-hyun's government. And at the time, progressive were really at disarray, and conservative won quite easily, led by Lee Myung-bak. And certainly, Korean people showed high interest in the election. So the rate was more than 77%. That's the highest since 1997. That reflects, I think, people's desire for change and reform. Especially younger people showed up at the booth. Normal people say that young people don't vote, but then in Korean case, they were very interested in elections, and they showed up. In terms of support, I think this time regionalism was weakened, but rather showed very high generational divide. So people in those 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, they all supported Moon Jae-in, but 60s and older, they went to support conservative candidate Hong Jun-pyo. In terms of regional distribution, Moon Jae-in carried pretty much all the regions other than Daegu and two Gyeongsang provinces. But still no one really dominated as in the past. For example, in the last election, Park Geun-hye got more than 80% in Daegu, and I think Moon Jae-in got like 90% in the Honam area. So in that sense, regionalism was quite
weakened this time, but rather generational divide was more salient. So that's sort of a brief summary of what happened. Okay, let me briefly talk about Moon Jae-in as president. Moon Jae-in has a very different personality than Park Geun-hye. I think Moon is quite approachable man. I don't know. I mean, I thought Park Geun-hye has charisma, but then it's not easy to really talk to her. But Moon Jae-in is definitely more approachable, and I think he communicates very well with the public and other stakeholders. So I think he just had a lunch with floor leaders of 5 parties. And let's say compared to Park Geun-hye, Moon Jae-in doesn't really, I just say, care less about protocol, and then it can be quite informal, quite casual. But at the same time, so far he has been very swift and decisive in making key appointments and some decisions. And as you know, Moon Jae-in took office right after election was over.
there was no period of transition team, so he had to appoint a few key people right away, including chief of staff. So as I'm looking at what he's doing for last week, actually he reminded me of Kim Young-sam, who came to power in mid-1990s, who was very swift and very decisive in making key decisions. And of course, it's early days, kind of honeymoon period, but still, he's getting good, support from people. And I think Gallup had a poll, I think yesterday or 2 days ago. It shows that about 87% of Koreans expect Moon Jae-in to do very well. So it's about 85% Kim Young-sam, about 79% from Lee Myung-bak, and about 70% for Park Geun-hye for similar poll. So in that sense, there's a lot of expectation for Moon Jae-in to succeed as president. And I hope that is the case. But at the same time, Korean presidency is a very tough job. Whoever comes to power is not going to be easy. So what are main challenges and opportunities, especially in politics and society? I mean, he has challenges in economic spheres, which I think Yong-suk will be discussing, and also in the security matters that Kathy will be focusing on. But first one, he has to work with other parties very closely. His party controls only 40% of the seats at the assembly, but he has to get at least 60% to pass any major bill in the assembly. But still, Korean president is very powerful. But now, over the years, assembly became much more stronger. So unless you really have 60% of support in the assembly, you really can't do much. The second issue, constitutional reform. As you know, there has been discussion about to change the constitution, especially power structure. As you know, right now, Korea has a single term, 5-year presidency, and it has a lot of problems. So Moon Jae-in promised that he will do a referendum next June during local election. So probably, between now and then, there will be a lot of debates about constitutional reform, especially about changing power structure. But also, I think he has a very unique opportunity to reshape the court. As you know, Korea has two court systems. One is Supreme Court, like United States, but also has constitutional courts that really delivered a final verdict on impeachment. So actually, for Supreme Court, during his term, Moon Jae-in is going to appoint Chief Justice and 12 other judges. Okay, so it's a really unique opportunity for him. For Constitutional Court, he just nominated Chief Justice, and then he will appoint 2 others. So, not only assembly, but court has become much more important. So by shaping these 2 important courts, I think Moon Jae-in has opportunity to really shape big pictures for Korean society. So the new nominee for as the chief of the Constitutional Court is Kim Il-soo. He represents progressive side. He was the only member of the court who opposed the dissolution of the Progressive Party a few years ago. So probably Moon can really push progressive agenda through court. So I think that's a great opportunity for Moon Jae-in, and I think in that sense, he should feel very lucky. Also, he has to, heal societal division. Now, still, Korea is deeply divided between conservative and progressive, and especially it got worse during impeachment and election. So right now, Korean conservatives are really on the defense, but I'm sure they will regroup and try to come back. So I think overall, there's a high expectation for reform and change, but how can he fulfill or even manage such expectation? That's something to be seen. Okay, let me ask one final question. Some people may wonder if Moon Jae-in will become the second Nomuhyun. Okay, I don't know what to think about, because Moon Jae-in was Nomuhyun's chief of staff, besides being very close friend for a long time, and there are overlaps in manpower between Nomuhyun and Moon Jae-in administrations. Particularly, now we are seeing some return of 386, now maybe 586 politicians and former activists. Among others, Im Jong-sok is now chief of staff for Moon Jae-in. He was a student activist in 1980s. He represented kind of NL faction. I don't know. There's a debate between NL and PD, National Liberation and People's Democracy factions. And then he's someone who's been arguing for more like independence, for Korea from, let's say, American dominance and so on. And then he was president. But of course, he served at the assembly for 2 terms. And I think he changed quite a bit. But he's one of those activists. The other one also appointed to senior advisor for Moon is Ha Seung-chang. He is also activist. And actually, he was a former fellow at our center. As some of you may remember, I ran like NGO fellowships for 3 years. Initially for 5 years, but then when Lee Myung-bak came into power, then it kind of we had to stop that. But so Ha Seung-chang was one of those NGO fellows at our center. So he's another example. So how they will shape the policy of Moon Jae-in, I mean, that's something I would watch quite closely. At the same time, I feel that Moon Jae-in and his key advisors must have learned lessons from the trial and error of the Nomuhyun government. And I think they are more experienced, and then I think well prepared during the last 2 terms of conservative rule. Okay, so in Korean context, when you are running for campaign, there's also a competition about how many experts, including professors, on your side. And this time, I think a lot of people came to work for Moon Jae-in campaign. So certainly he has a lot of manpower around him. In a sense, maybe too many people compete for positions, so he may have a little trouble in, finding jobs for all those people who supported him during the campaign. So when Nomuhyun became president, I think he got by himself surprised that he became president. There are very few number of intellectuals and experts who are supporting Nomuhyun during campaign. So compared to that, Moon Jae-in really had a lot of support from experts and professionals and intellectuals. So that's why I don't think Moon Jae-in will become second Nomuhyun. I think he's more confident, he's more prepared. But at the same time, I'm sure he will push for progressive agenda. So, and then finally, whether he will pursue sunshine policy number 2, I leave to Kathy for that. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll talk about the economic policy aspect of the next administration. The way I'll do this is I'll identify a few key challenges that the current South Korean economy is facing, and then discuss how the new administration might respond to this given what we've been seeing. Obviously, there hasn't been much appointment in the economic policy arena yet, but there has been a few. And the things that I would like to highlight is, and these are the things that probably has come up and is coming up currently, is job creation, income inequality, conglomerate reform, innovation and entrepreneurship, and human capital, especially related to technology. So I'll just briefly touch upon some of the international contexts that might be relevant, like trade and inter-Korean relations, but not too much in detail. So one thing in terms of job issues, unemployment rate has been increasing among the youth in South Korea quite a bit. Right now, it's hovering around 10%. So this is for the age group between 15 and 29. So that's the age group that we're calling youth. But on the contrary, total unemployment rate has been steady. So most of the issue relating to unemployment and concerns are surrounding this young population. So the first thing that Moon did since becoming president was to create a job committee. That's the first thing he actually announced. And that's following up on his promise that he would create 800,000 public sector jobs, including those that he would plan to shift from temporary jobs in the public sector to full-time employees. And other things he plans to do is reduce work hours so that he can increase employment by actually adding in more employees. And these are all in line with his emphasis on focusing on the people, creating them jobs, and empowering people economically for a source of economic growth. So it's not that different from the agenda, for instance, Trump had coming into power, or many other fiscally driven policies. These policies would generate jobs in the short run, but whether these policies would generate growth is a different story, different matter. Japan had a policy, similar policy, that they pursued during their low growth periods in the 1990s, very intense fiscal policies, but eventually they had to scale back because of ballooning budget deficits. However, he hasn't provided a clear pathway as to how he would raise the money, basically, for these issues. Taxes, ultimately, and also how private firms might respond to increased public expenditure. So one would think about, okay, first, one of the things he actually claimed is that he would raise the minimum wage as well, and then private firms will be wary about that, obviously. But also, if the public sector increases dramatically, how would the private sector actually respond in terms of the number of jobs, right? Could they actually crowd out the private sector? So that's something to think about. But there hasn't been much discussion on that. More fundamentally, my concern is whether these policies will raise the standard of living, ultimately, which is wages, right? Creating more jobs, creating more opportunities, that's jobs. Whether that actually improves the standard of living is a different matter. And to do that, you need to raise productivity. Whether these policies will actually raise productivity or whether they will linger on as public sector corporations with low productivity but high wage institutions, like we often see in state-owned enterprises around the world. So that's a potential concern, but something that potentially he'll think about and address. One last point back to youth unemployment. One thing that the Moon administration really hasn't laid out clearly is how unemployment relates to the issue of aging in South Korea. South Korea is the most rapidly aging country in the globe at this point. Aging has been discussed in relation to pensions and Social Security, but the fact that the increase in retirement age and firms are now very reluctant to hire new people because now they have to hold on to more people, older people, actually has had a substantial impact on the youth unemployment. Next, on income inequality, South Korea is actually a very unequal society. Gender wage gap among OECD countries, South Korea is by large the largest. So this is the gap. So this is saying that about 36.7, there's a difference between male and wage gap on average, and that's about 36.7%. and that's way above other countries. This is more about inequality, especially relating to some issues of low-income inequality. So this is a share of workers earning less than 2/3 of the median earnings. And South Korea is third among OECD countries, about 25%. So the inequality in South Korea is more towards inequality among the lower income population. It's not like super high income inequality driving inequality in the case like US. It's more the case similar to Japan and South Korea. There's a lot of low income population, and that's pushing down wages as well as increasing inequality of society. Now, Moon has pledged to raise the minimum wage, provide more subsidies to young families, reduce subsidized transportation costs, and try to alleviate the financial burdens of low-income households. That was his pledge, but whether that actually tackles inequality is a different matter, right? It does alleviate some of the concerns of low-income families, but does it actually increase the wages of the lower-income population? That's a different thing. And one of the major concerns with South Korean context, so there's many drivers of inequality across the world, technological change, globalization, but in the case of South Korea, there's an argument that there's a lot of lack of good paying jobs and many low paying jobs. And there's just not many opportunities for young people. And what that also implies that there's a very few set of firms that are very highly productive that are able to provide the wages that they can offer, and a lot of other low productivity firms that can't provide good wages. So in some sense, the inequality of wages is directly related to the inequality of performance of firms, and there's increasingly concentration of better, well-performing firms, small set of firms, at the neglect of smaller size firms. So Moon's emphasis on people as a source of economic growth is a nice ideal, but unless there's way to increase wage levels, especially of the lower income people, economic growth driven by domestic consumption will be a challenge going forward. So then this leads to my next point on firms, the fact that there needs to be some reform, especially related to conglomerate reform. Okay? So conglomerates like the Samsung, LG, Hyundai, SK comprise a very large part of South Korea's economy. Their brands permeate all aspects of South Korean life, from electronics, household appliances, but even the apartment, the houses you live in, the shopping mall you go to, and even the occasional amusement park you go to. So there has been increase that the South Korean economy is increasingly being dominated by these conglomerates. And here, what I show here is, okay, this is 1997. This is when the Asian financial crisis. So leading up to the Asian financial crisis, there's massive assets being accumulated along these major conglomerates, and then they went bust, right? And then what's happening after that? There's been a lot of reforms there, but still, they've been concentrating their market share substantially. This is in asset terms, but if you use different measures, this trend is pretty much the same. And what's very noticeable is not the top 30 conglomerates, the green line. The red is the top 4, Samsung, Hyundai, SK, and LG. And what's noticeable is how they're way above 1997 levels now, right? So the concentration along these few number of firms has been very large. Now, I don't want to say that this itself is a problem. If they're productive and they're performing well, that's perfectly fine. There are issues related to just general issues related to the concentration of economic activity of few firms. But apart from that, if this is driven by productivity, let's take that away and assume that it's okay. But the main problem is the right-hand side, and which was the main issue behind the past impeachment, was corruption. Conglomerates with political elites may be wielding power that is not in the interest of markets and investors, and that has been the main concern, right? Many people believe that this hands-on relationship was a remnant of the past, but it seems like Park Geun-hye actually embraced influence peddling, and she didn't even think it was an issue. I think she thought it was a very natural thing, because that's what the Korean government has been doing all along. Moon Jae-in is actually tackling this heads-on, and one of his major appointment is Kim Sang-jo, who's actually the author of this, and he's a specialist in in chaebols in South Korea, he appointed Kim to the Fair Trade Commission, and he has pledged to strengthen oversight on the top 4 chaebols of Korea, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and SK. But he announced that his approach would be to maintain, not change anything drastically, just maintain current regulations, but more focus on actually administrating and making sure these firms are following existing regulations. In other words, he has explicitly acknowledged that he understands the role large firms have played in South Korea's economy and wouldn't be cracking down on these conglomerates just for the sake of ideological reasons. And I think this is very encouraging. He's focusing on the rule of law and while respecting market forces. I think that's the appropriate way for conglomerate reform. There needs to be some reform. I agree with that aspect, but it shouldn't be done in a top-down manner. But encouraging competition by enabling an environment where there can be competition from new incumbents and smaller incumbents. And I think the current assignment of Kim Sang-jo to the Fair Trade Commission may actually well take this point. So I think it's an encouraging avenue. Now this takes to my 4th point on innovation and entrepreneurship. To actually break away from this dependence of conglomerates, Korea needs innovative firms and entrepreneurial talent. I don't think Koreans lack in their innovative abilities per se. They have the technological, creative abilities that we see around firms that are performing well around the world, artists and performers. But I think they do lack the institutional and educational system that enable people to organize and create entrepreneurial ventures. And governments have known this for a long time. Since the Asian financial crisis, each of these governments has had an innovation policy. It differs slightly by name, but it's very similar in context. So, for instance, the Kim Dae-jung administration, after the Asian financial crisis, advanced a policy to support venture firms and entrepreneurship. Eventually led into the bust, but now we have some well-known tech firms that were created by them, like for instance, Naver and Daum Kakao. Nomuyeon had advanced the Vision 2030, which aimed to increase productivity while moving away from catch-up growth, and identified robotics, future automobiles, biotech as areas of growth. Sounds very familiar, right? Lee Myung-byuk pursued green growth agenda, which focused on future growth technologies such as software, contents, IT, etc. Park Geun-hye's creative economy was also very similar. It's pretty much the same with slightly just different flavors. So in other words, each administration had pursued very similar innovation policies. They identified key areas for growth and then created or reorganized organizations, allocated budget, and implemented these budgets. Moon what he has done is he actually announced yesterday that there used to be an administration for small businesses, like the Small Business Administration in the US. He's elevated that to ministry level, and it's named it Ministry of Small Business, Small, Medium, and Venture Business. That's the tentative name, and has decided to double the budget that goes to this entity. So we're not sure, but that's the first move he made. But we'll see. We'll get to know more about this ministry going forward. But I hope that it'll be able to break the past cycle of these just creating certain areas of growth, allocating funds. Because the main difference between innovation policy and industrial policy is that innovation policies need to be innovative, and hence people aren't really sure, can't know a priori which areas can be a source of innovative growth. So fostering the environment for innovation is probably the more important aspect that the new administration could pursue. Finally, to human capital. So worker productivity is fundamental to growth. This chart is showing that, so compared to most OECD countries, South Korea relied on its growth from increasing labor input, basically working longer hours, not by increasing their productivity. So they weren't very good at being productive, but they were good at increasing input labor hour. And now if you think about this, And then the future technology, wave of technology that's much more innovative and potentially disruptive, like robotics, data analytics, artificial intelligence, etc. Whether Korea will have the right labor force to actually incorporate these change is a big issue. Moon has actually pledged to create a committee on the fourth industrial revolution. We'll see if he actually follows through. But that's basically a committee that directs investments on big data, robotics, electric cars, etc. But what's probably more important in this regard is I haven't seen much discussion relating to human capital in terms of training, education sense to these new skills. Because what we see here is the share of inactive youth with a college degree in Korea is highest among OECD countries. So that's the share. So it's substantially higher. So inactive meaning that they don't have jobs, they're not looking for, they're not taking any education, and they're not taking any training. Basically inactive in the market. And with these new set of skills, how are you going to utilize this unutilized talent? And what kind of training can you provide will be probably more fundamental to just allocating certain areas of development and moving forward. Okay, so that's my main key points. Just finally, just briefly on international trade. So with the Trump administration's decision to re-examine Korea's U.S. FTA, the new administration had scrambled to mitigate this impact. I think they're trying to. Moon has moved the international trade operation back into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The previous government actually moved it to the Ministry of Commerce, which was slightly awkward. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will probably have better negotiating skills. However, given that Moon's focus currently is to increase domestic demand, not really focus on international trade, and given that Trump is his counterpart, it could be wise to take a more transactional and deals-based approach to trade until the next year's administration. Lastly, on inter-Korean relations and economic engagement, North Korea's cheap labor and natural resources is a major source of potential source of asset for South Korea's growth. If they are able to build a sustainable and stable trade investment relationship with the North, I think could be beneficial. But whether that's feasible in an international foreign policy context, I'm not sure. But we'll see whether Moon first acts upon reopening the Kaesong Industrial Park. I think that will be a signal. So for now, the economy will show signs of growth because it's been in a very low point, frozen investment and frozen demand under Park Geun-hye's past administration. So naturally, we'll see some growth. Whether he'll follow through on these reforms and will encourage further growth, we'll see going forward. Thank you.
All right, well, I'm happy to join the panel. When we discussed having this today, we titled it Wind of Change ? And with the idea of looking at whoever we didn't know, although I think Professor Shin knew, but and predicted rightly, but we didn't know who the next president would be, the new president would be. But as we look at the new Korean administration, it's only, of course, been 2 weeks since it feels like longer, since Moon Jae-in was elected and took office immediately. But already I would change the title, I think, to maybe no question mark. I think there'll be change, and I would call it Winds of Change. Because I think there will be momentum coming from Seoul, from the new administration, that will affect Korea's interactions with its friends and partners and with North Korea. But I also think there are cross currents, there are winds coming into the Republic of Korea. Moon Jae-in takes office at a time in a much changed international environment, and I want to talk a little bit about that as well. I would certainly underscore what's already been well said by Professor Shin and by Young, that expectations are extremely high in South Korea. I was there just a couple of weeks ago. And certainly throughout the campaign period, the issues that people were focused on were the ones, a lot of the ones that Young was talking about, and Gyuk, mostly domestic, corruption, shortcomings in Korea's own democratic institutions, including the overconcentration of power in the president, the relationship between the chaebol and the government, and of course the inequality gap, which I hear young people talk about not only in terms of income, although it's important, but in terms of prospects. This notion that something that some young people called hell chosen, that the system is rigged, that upward mobility has been too constrained. So and these are the young people who came out and were on the streets. They weren't all so young, some were in their 30s and 40s, but who demanded the resignation of President Park Geun-hye, something that the political class itself was not calling for, and then voted for Moon Jae-in with enormous expectations, which I think will be very, very challenging for him to address. I was thinking, I was watching a YouTube this morning as I got ready of Professor Shen's description of Moon Jae-in as a more approachable person than his predecessor, and indeed perhaps than any recent Korean president. The new president, President Moon, was in Gwangju on May 17th, 2 days ago, to attend the annual commemoration of the Gwangju Uprising, the 1980 hallmark and an important point in Korea's democratic journey, very tragic event. And he did something which nobody expected after a young woman who had been born at the time of Gwangju talked about the loss of her father. He got up and moved across the stage and simply hugged her. I don't think I've ever seen a moment like that, quite like that, in Korean presidential politics before. So I think there's a sense that he's going to be something a little different. But again, as the polls show, expectations are high. He's only been in office for 2 weeks. So let me focus on the external environment. And here, I'd say at this point, the main expectation and anxiety on the part of South Koreans, and I think this goes across the political spectrum, is that Korea get back in the game. Now, no one on any side of the political spectrum likes to see what they call sometimes Korea passing or Seoul passing, the small country among great powers. And Korea hasn't really been at the table. Certainly they've had an acting president. Certainly they have a highly competent professional diplomatic and civil service. And the wheels of government, including foreign policy, have continued to turn. But they feel like they've been not at the table. And it's not like the world has stood still. What are some of the things he's facing? I mean, I think we can just knock them off. I mean, list them without a lot of elaboration. North Korea, of course. Kim Jong-un, now in power, going on 6 years, and clearly determined and aggressive in pushing forward on his nuclear and missile programs. In the United States, a president who's even newer than Kim Jong-un, more inexperienced and unpredictable, perhaps, than the leader in Pyongyang, and who's raised a number of issues over the course of both his campaign and his early presidency, including a reassessment of burden sharing, a renegotiation of the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, and of course a lot of speculation on what and how what the U.S. approach to North Korea will be and how that will mesh with Moon Jae-in. Let me say a word here, since Gyok had already mentioned it, of sort of the idea of the sunshine policy. Moon Jae-in does indeed come from the progressive side of the political spectrum, and was a supporter and, of course, chief of staff to the two presidents, Kim Dae-jung, followed by Roh Moo-hyun, Roh Moo-hyun's chief of staff, who pursued an explicitly sunshine policy of emphasizing engagement towards North Korea, kind of through thick and thin. But I kind of think sunshine as a word, as a bumper sticker, is a little bit like now strategic patience in the United States. You have to get actually into discussion of what do we mean by strategic patience and how did it change over time. You might get the same discussion about sunshine in a different way. What's different, I think, is that while the Trump administration, following the Obama administration, was eager to say strategic patience is dead, while at the same time outlining a policy which in many aspects sounds a lot like the aspects of the Obama policy. In the case of Moon Jae-in, it may be a little bit different. He certainly is not going to disavow the legacy of Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun. And he certainly has said, and he said during the campaign, that he wants to follow that legacy. But I think that he recognizes that times have changed, and indeed, if we look at the things he's done just in the first 2 weeks of his administration, we see that I think that he's going to respond to what he sees as the situation today, And also something that may affect somewhat his thinking is that, again, a lot of his support, it comes from a younger generation whose attitudes about North Korea, people in their 20s or so, have also changed a bit. And I can talk a little bit more about that later. But I'll get back to North Korea in a minute. But just to say about the rest of the external environment, with respect to China, relations between the ROK and China are at one of their lowest points since normalization 25 years ago in 1992. China has over some months been essentially sanctioning and punishing South Korea, pressuring it over its agreement to allow the deployment of the U.S. missile defense system, THAAD, which China sees threatening its own defense posture. South Korea-Japan relations, always very challenging, have seen continued friction, cooperation in certain areas quietly, but limits to that cooperation due to, I think, continued unhappiness on both sides with the way the Comfort Woman Agreement has or has not been observed and carried out, and the question, which was certainly discussed and raised during the South Korean election campaign, of whether it will be reopened, something the Japanese and Prime Minister Abe would be very unhappy about. And globally, of course, Moon comes to power at a time when the international climate sees the rise of anti-trade and populist anti-globalization forces. Korea is in no position to be anti-globalist. Right? It is a trading nation par excellence, but it will be buffeted by these winds as well. So what's happened so far in these 2 weeks? I thought maybe I'd talk more about that than what Moon said during the campaign, because already the campaign fades in memory. Moon did a round of phone calls with leaders of major countries, including President Trump, Xi Jinping. And interestingly, I think it's a fairly creative approach to the need to, say, be sworn in, get going right away. He named special envoys who've been deployed to a variety of world capitals already. So actually, most of my preparation for what I was going to say today came from reading the Korean press, full disclosure, today and yesterday, because these are actually meetings and comments that have taken place just over the last couple of days. But also, in the meantime, the DPRK, North Korea, never to be forgotten for too long. While it was certainly assumed that, North Korea, Pyongyang had been pretty vicious towards President Park in terms of its rhetoric and so on, seemed to perhaps be looking for some kind of opening with President Moon, but within a few days of his inauguration, and again, perhaps it has absolutely nothing to do with his inauguration and more to do with their own testing program, but they test-fired a missile last weekend described by the New York Times as, quote, tiptoeing over a U.S. tripwire, of course, on getting closer to an intercontinental ballistic missile, certainly a very important and concerning test. I want to highlight that because Moon's response was very tough. And here's what he said while visiting the defense ministry. Launching ballistic missiles is a serious provocation that violates UN Security Council resolutions, as well as being a serious challenge to global peace and stability. We will never tolerate, another time it was translated, accept, we will never tolerate such North Korean provocations and nuclear threats. We will sternly deal with the North together with the international community. And the president also reaffirmed his earlier pledge to expand the defense budget, modernize the country's weapons system, and gradually increase the defense budget to 3% from the current 2.4%. This kind of response, he also said that dialogue with North Korea was only possible if North Korea changes its attitude. So NK said just yesterday, Moon should learn a lesson from the Yushin dictator, that means the daughter Park, and relating it to Park Chung-hee, sin against inter-Korean unification, and stop talking big over confrontation in parallel with dialogue. So a rather cool start to the return of sunshine, I would say, but something to watch. I certainly expect President Moon to make the effort to see what's possible. I think any new Korean president will do that. Any new Korean president wants to be the president on whose watch there's a breakthrough with North Korea. But I think right now his focus is upon building relationships particularly with the United States, but also with partners. I myself, I don't have a good track record I don't have any track record, I guess, but my prediction would not be for an early opening of the Kaesong Industrial Park for a variety of reasons I could discuss. I think certainly there might be some efforts to resume family reunification meetings. Again, the resistance to that has often come more from the northern side than from the southern side. Some effort to reopen the aperture on humanitarian efforts and other things that can be considered to be consistent with the ever more robust set of sanctions to which the South Korea has also signed up as a member of the United Nations, as well as bilaterally. And perhaps things is a little bit further down the road, but not that far, discussions on possible cooperation for the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, which of course will be held in the divided province of Gangwon. There was a reference already from the new Moon administration just sort of saying, you know, if North Korean athletes come, we can open the road, we can do things. So I think they will certainly be looking for some opportunities. But right now, I say the prospects don't look terribly great. Now, a word about U.S. ROK relations. During the interim period between President Park's impeachment and while she was, so when there was an acting president, the new Trump administration, to his credit, engaged with the acting president and with the authorities in Seoul, sending Mr. Mattis, Mr. Tillerson to South Korea. Mr. Pompeo has been there recently, and Vice President Pence as well. Now with President Moon elected, we saw just earlier this week the senior director, Matt Pottinger from the White House, out there to talk about a summit, and it's been suggested that there may be a late June summit in Washington. So all to the good. Of the special envoys who've been appointed, Ambassador Hong Seok-hyun, who some of you may know was formerly U.S. or Korean ambassador to the U.S., was in Washington this week. Saw senior people in the White House, including President Trump, delivered a letter from President Moon, who reportedly, all my information comes from the Korean side, I have to say, so. But I trust it, I'm saying. But Mr. Trump reportedly called Mr. Moon's letter a beautiful letter.
That matters.
Yeah. And Mr. Hong, Ambassador Hong, praised U.S. efforts to encourage China to do more on North Korea. And in other words, I mean, clearly the South Korean side is trying to communicate strong coordination and strong relationship building with the Trump administration. Again, according to Special Envoy Hong, there was an agreement that there should be no talk for talk's sakes. The aim is denuclearization, but not regime change. Again, this sounds a little bit like the previous policies of several administrations, but reinforced here. And when it came to the issue of THAAD, which again has been much in the news because of differing signals coming out of the Trump administration, the South Korean side under President Moon seemed to be emphasizing the need for procedures, in other words, for some kind of National Assembly review or blessing of it, rather than explicitly talking about its removal now that it's actually been deployed on South Korean soil. Korea-U.S. free trade agreement, unclear how that will go. That's another thing where it doesn't seem to have really come up yet, except that President Trump, again, mentioned it a couple of weeks ago as something, an unfair agreement that needed to be renegotiated. The initiative of that clearly will come from the U.S. side, and I think Korea is getting prepared to deal with it if it does, but perhaps with the renegotiation of NAFTA now beginning, that will go down on the priority list in the White House. China, again, a special envoy has been there, Mr. Lee Hae-chan. He was there yesterday. He had an audience with Xi Jinping, and they discussed perhaps Moon and Xi meeting on the margin of a G20 meeting in Germany in July. This year, this summer actually, these things are important, I think more important maybe in Asia than here, the anniversaries. August 24th marks 25 years since the normalization of relations between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of Korea. These are two countries that have a long historical relationship, so historical that supposedly Xi Jinping told President Trump that Korea used to be a part of China, but let's skip over that for now. 25 years of bilateral official relationships, and some signs, I think, that China may be trying to find a way, along with South Korea, of putting the THAAD issue behind them, which is not to say that the issue of defensive measures taken to address the growing North Korean missile and nuclear threat, as well as the whole approach to North Korea, will not continue to be an area of considerable, not only importance, but probably disagreement at various times in the months ahead. The number of Chinese visitors seems to be inching up again. The Korean press is reporting less pressure from Korean customs. This gets to that question of to what extent has China really hurt South Korea with its informal sanctions on South Korean goods, South Korean cosmetics, K-pop bands not being able to get visas to go to China, boatloads of Chinese tourists not being allowed to disembark, and by the Chinese side, not the South Korean side, in South Korean ports. It will be interesting to see in the coming weeks whether there's now an effort to try to just get things back to status quo ante. My sense, again, from a rather one-sided point of view, I suppose, it being in South Korea a couple of times in the last few months, is that this kind of Chinese pressure really damaged the Chinese, positive feelings, generally positive feelings on the part of South Koreans towards China. It was very heavy-handed, very punitive. And I think it actually, ironically, made a lot of South Koreans think, well, if the Chinese are going to try to make us not have bad, right? Well, we're going to have it. They shouldn't be pushing us around. So I think it was a bit counterproductive. On Japan, Dan has looked at this very closely, and I'd be interested in his thoughts on it. I mean, President Moon has said that he wants to revive what he called shuttle diplomacy, which is something from the Nomuhyun era, have a future-oriented discussion, future-oriented relationship, and wants an early summit. Mr. Moon, as did all the other candidates, had called during the campaign for a sort of a renegotiation of the Comfort Woman agreement. That apparently has not been discussed since he's been reelected. But there has been some suggestion, including from the Moon camp, that a two-track approach of separating so-called historical issues from current issues might be an effort worth trying. So all in all, I think Moon is off to a good start. The special envoy approach was a good way of kickstarting Korean diplomacy. I think he also had special envoys, I won't go into all of them, to the Vatican, the EU, ASEAN. And I think it's reassured allies and partners. He does have a strong mandate at home, at least for now. And clearly, as time goes on, not even as time goes on, clearly, just to reiterate, he will want to find a way to engage with North Korea. But I think he recognizes that he needs to build other relationships first and to try to work in as close a coordination, having seen some difficult lessons from the past, with the new administration in Washington.
In some democratic country, when the outgoing president was truncated in his or her term due to constitutional misconduct, the newly elected probably just serve out the remaining normal term rather than a new term. But in this Korean case, this new person would have a full 5-year term, right? So there is no such thing as the interim.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's a full 5-year term. Yeah.
It's just an early election.
So he had a full mandate for the full term.
Right.
Unless something happens.
Another scandal.
Does it go to the end of
No, it resets the
December,
clock.
or does
No,
it
just 5 years from May.
from
May,
so now elections will be held in May?
Right, so Koreans will have better time to vote. Spring rather than in winter.
Gee, I miss those December elections. Though. Nice freezing cold while
Unless
you're
there is
watching.
constitutional revision.
reform.
You see.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's right.
I'm just curious to know why Ambassador Stephens thinks that it's unlikely that the Kaesong area might be reopened, assuming obviously that there are some improvements in the relationship between North Korea and South Korea. But why would the Kaesong area be out of question?
I guess, and again, this is my opinion. I welcome other thoughts, and you all may have some on it. The reopening of Kaesong Industrial Park does not strike me as kind of the low-hanging fruit. If you're going to make a list of what are some areas where South Korea could try to, reopen some projects and engagement with North Korea. I think there are some areas more in the humanitarian area. You do have a sanctions regime, which is complicated. And I think that South Korea will certainly, feel obliged to abide by it or make the argument as to why whatever they do is within the bounds of sanctions, or get them changed, but in exchange for some, or exception for some justification or change in North Korean behavior. It's just, and maybe things have just kind of moved on. The Kaesong Industrial Park employed about 50,000 North Korean workers. A couple of hundred, I think, South Korean companies. It was a big infrastructure, and it's been closed. It's been mothballed. It's kind of like saying, how do you reopen a mothballed, enterprise? It doesn't happen too quickly. So it just doesn't seem to me the most practical thing to start with. Do you?
Yeah, I kind of agree that eventually they'll try to reopen Kaesong, and then even maybe established new complex like Kaesong. But I think he will go very carefully. I don't think he'll rush to just open Kaesong, because he has to deal with international community who put sanctions on North Korea, also domestic audience. There's always concern that he might be accused of being like pro-North Korea or whatever. So I think he has to address both international and domestic audience. So I think he'll find a way to reopen eventually. But my view is that, Kathy, I think he'll go a little slowly than rush.
I wonder if I could raise a question, which I don't think any of you touched on. So one of the question of the corruption issues, and particularly, of course, the corruption cases that led to these events, there are still some rather delicate issues out there in terms of the prosecution of President Park Geun-hye, as well as the CEO of Samsung. And I'm wondering if there's any indication early on, how Moon intends to handle that, and B, what are the expectations of these Korean voters, particularly these young Korean voters who, as I understand it, were heavily motivated, after all, by the desire for belief that justice needed to be done here. They're out in the streets for months. So what are they expecting will happen, and how might this play out in terms of Korean domestic politics?
I think that's a very important and tough question, because I think Moon will be facing dilemma. Okay, on the one hand, you have to address people's cry for social justice and anti-corruption reform, but at the same time, he has to sort of reconcile with those who opposed him, and also despite all those critiques against Samsung, Samsung is very important player for the Korean economy. So obviously both JY and Park Geun-hye will have to go through a trial in the court. You really can't do anything until the final decision is made at the court. And my prediction, once again, I'm just predicting that probably after court decision is made, I think Moon Jae may have to pardon Park Geun-hye. So Park Geun-hye may serve a year, maybe 2 in prison, but I don't think he can let her stay, for many years in prison, because. You may remember that when MB won the election, and I told people that don't write off progressive, they'll come back, and then they came back with this mad cow disease, in a protest, right? So now certainly conservatives are really weakened, but they're not gone really. So eventually, if you really wanted to do any major reform, you have to get certain support from oppositions, and that's why politically, Moon may have to pardon Park Geun-hye maybe after a year or something. But I think with JY, maybe it's more difficult, because now, unlike in the past, some chaebol owners, they serve. They're almost full terms, like Choi Tae-won of SK. He was in prison for about like 4 years, I think, right? So it may be more difficult to pardon JY. So he might, I don't know, depending on the court decision, he might spend more time in prison. So, that's a dilemma that he will have to deal with.
I actually had a question, just comment on it. So,
Yeah.
how does the prosecutor office reform relate to this issue? Maybe, like currently, there's a lot of reform on the prosecutor's office. How might that relate to this? Would it be?
I think there are two issues. One is Korean prosecutor's office has too much power. Okay, and the other issue, they are highly politicized. Okay, so I think weakening the power of prosecutor's office, I mean, that's the right direction to do. I mean, that's what Nomuyon tried to do, but didn't really succeed. But regarding politicization, I mean, that's, I don't know, it depends on how you view, because he made a few key appointments, and from those who support Moon Jae-in, it's really reforming. But from other side's perspective, also he's picking up his kind of people who can support his agenda. So I mean, there are two issues that are related but not really the same. I think they'll try to weaken prosecutor's office. They have too much power.
Yeah.
I am curious about the corruption issue. You mentioned that the youth feel that corruption is becoming more and more. Is it just limited to the things that happened with the former president, or does the youth feel in general in the society, and when they are so young, can they compare and do they see that it happening, more corruption in just those recent years or 1 decade? I'm just curious about how come that they feel such a feeling
I'm not sure Korea is having more corruption, but I think it's more difficult to get away. That's a problem, because once again, I think I said this thing maybe last time when we had a similar panel, that what Park Geun-hye did now, 20 years ago was okay, but not anymore. So it's not that Korea had more corruption, but now Koreans are less willing to tolerate. Right.
Then feel like they see that more strongly compared with 20 years ago.
Right. So, for example, like if you look at JY, Lee of Samsung, and Park Geun-hye, okay, they were the two most powerful people in the country. President, and then the owner of Samsung. But even they are in jail. So that means that no one is immune from punishment with corruption. I mean, that's why Moon Jae-in and his people will be more careful, and I think Korean society as a whole will be better in terms of corruption. That's from my view. I mean, it's not that they have more corruption, but then Korea is less tolerant.
Mike?
It seems the U.S. in dealing with North Korea is looking at strengthening sanctions. I assume from everything I've heard that the South Korean government would be less inclined to augment them. So how do you see the problem of coordinating policy toward the North between the U.S. and Seoul in the coming months?
Yeah, I think it's going to be challenging, but I'm not sure yet. I'm really not. We've gotten so many different kind of signals out of the Trump administration so far about the relationship between pressure and dialogue, and I think Moon is correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think he's made a really big deal about sanctions. When it comes to sanctions, he said yes, we're in favor of them. I think the difference may be over whether Seoul may see some opening or where Seoul wants to, notwithstanding sanctions, kind of say on the basis of South-South, intra-Korean, reconciliation, we want to do this. And the Trump administration may feel that's creating some distance between, in our kind of united pressure on North Korea. But I don't think that South Korea is going to be against sanctions. I mean, international sanctions.
The Kaesong Project was never considered to be in violation of the UN sanctions regime, although I never quite understood why. Nobody raised it in those terms. And I think the language of the UN sanctions regime probably has always had certain loopholes in it. But so I think there are certain things the South Koreans can do that will not be, technically speaking, considered to be a violation of those two sets of UN sanctions. There are other things, though, that I think were done in the past that probably would be. I mean, if you resumed certain kinds of, particularly trade, because I think in the actual formal trade has dropped off heavily. There were purchases, just normal interstate trade. Those kinds of things would be problematic. I don't know, or humanitarian relief would not be a problem. There are things they can do, I think, if they want to pursue an engagement strategy that will not necessarily cross a line as far as sanctions go. And as far as I've seen, the main discussion about additional sanctions and going back to the UN has to do with the Chinese-North Korean trade, as well as the things like financial transfers and stuff like that, which the South Koreans don't do anyway. So.
Oh, and I think South Korea will want something for resuming. I don't think they're just going to do it. So the question will be, will Washington feel they're not getting enough, or this is creating too much of a two-track approach? And I could see that happening, but
Also, it may not be easy, but there might be good opportunity for South Korea to take a lead. That's I've been telling to South Koreans, because Trump is sending a lot of confusing messages. It might be maybe he doesn't know what to do. So sometimes it looks like he's taking a very hardline approach, but the next day maybe we need to talk to North Koreans. So if South Korea has a very good policy and maybe talk to United States, I think there's some chance of good collaboration between U.S. and South Korea. And regarding engaging North Korea, China will be very happy. Chinese been complaining that, why you just keep pressing me? It's not my problem, right? Then why I get blamed all the time, right? And also, North Koreans are very concerned about over-dependence on China. So having some engagement with South Korea will be useful for them. So it's not easy, but at the same time, this might be a good chance for South Korea to be more proactive in engaging North Korea.
In the back, all the way. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Felix Soro. I'm a member of the community, and I have a question for Professor Shin and also for Director Lee. First question has to do with the upcoming referendum on the Constitution. And I would like to know what are the key elements of this referendum and what is expected to result from this change in the Constitution. How much of it is in response to changes in the world geopolitical situation? Turkey had a similar referendum recently that was in response to changes in the region. And for Lee, I'm curious to know, you mentioned that there is this emphasis on innovation, and yet Korea's economy is dominated by these very large conglomerates. And to what extent does that reality have an impact on this long-standing objective to make Korea a more competitive and more innovative economy? And I think a couple of weeks ago there was a seminar on educational system in Korea, and there again there was this emphasis on using the secondary education system as a basis for making those changes. So I'm very curious to hear your comments in that regard.
Okay, so regarding referendum, the main thing is to maybe change the current single-term 5-year presidency. Okay, so right now you can run for re-election. 5 years and you're out. Therefore, including people saying that the next day after election is over, people begin to talk about next election, and then the president can be getting a lame duck, after maybe like 3-4 years, right? So that will be, I think, key issue. I think some options are maybe like making 2-term, allow for re-election. That's one possibility. The other one, something similar to like France, like president and then a prime minister. Okay, so balance of power. As a cabinet system is another possibility. So I think there's a special committee at the assembly to discuss this issue. And in the past, a lot of talks about such a reform, but never happened. But Moon Jae-in promised that he will agree on referendum next June. So, but at the same time, because of different political interests, there will be some conflict about what system they are going to propose. So there will be some debates and some maybe contentions over the next year. But if he keeps his promise, then there will be referendum about this reform. Yeah.
So that's the only item?
No, that's not. That's the main one. And also they are talking about changing. Okay, right now, for each district, you elect only one person, but maybe allow 2-3 people, because the trouble is that that's why like in Honam area, almost everybody or 90% come from opposition, for example, in the past. So there's a very strong regional concentration. So in order to make it more even, you might allow for more than one person to be elected in single district. So that's other item. Yeah.
And so on the issue of large businesses and innovation, in some sense, if you think about the Korean economy, they've been doing pretty well in terms of innovating, and these were driven by large businesses. I think the main concern is that it's the concentration of these innovation activities and the implication for it further down the road, and the types of innovation that actually is being nurtured. For instance, in large organizations, there are a set of type of innovations that they can pursue better compared to smaller firms, but it's only confined to those type of innovations, and allowing smaller firms to actually venture out to different things rather than just eating up all these type of innovations is, I think, the main concern in terms of the concentration aspect. And regarding education, I think it's a bit of a challenge. I think the one thing that was brought up in last talk was about these tech schools in high school levels. Whether that ultimately gets at this innovation, I'm not really sure. I think it's more of a different type of technical skill education. But I think it relates to whether one of the things that when surveys look into South Korea is that when students respond that they're not trained, they don't believe that they're trained to be entrepreneurial. And just the idea of what's needed to become entrepreneurial and those type of trainings are not really well done. And I think embedding those in the education system from early on could, I think, benefit those individuals potentially.
Yes.
Are there any long-term studies that measure stress and any impact on the economic productivity of the country or the health of the Korean people living with North Korea as a neighbor? I'm just curious whether or not there's been any consequence over time on the population of having a certain level of stress, or is it like living on the San Andreas Fault and you turn
It's a good question.
So, a few weeks ago, I had an interview with a reporter in Beijing working for Christian Science Monitor. He had the same question, why Koreans don't seem to, pay my attention to North Korean threats, but more on elections. So I said, well, they're used to living with that. So when something happened, like on the Korean Peninsula, people hear, oh, are you okay? Your country is okay. But if I talk to Koreans in Korea, they say, what are you talking about? Right? So, I mean, you get used to it, I think, yeah.
But I also have to, there are studies that show that South Korea is one of the most stressed out places in the world.
Not because of North Korea.
No, but not because of North Korea. I mean, it almost goes back to the question about this sensitivity to corruption and the anger against, Park Geun-hye. I mean, especially among young people, although, I mean, the suicide rate among old people is very high. This is a country that has gone through an extraordinary change, and much of it positive, most of it over the last, 60 years. But I think in its politics, and that's kind of what we're seeing is some real generational cleavages and a sense that Korea has just been kind of head spinning. And in this hyper competitive environment where now everybody can go to college, there's just not enough appropriate opportunity for everybody, those kinds of things. So that's where you see real stress. And yeah, it's a serious social issue, but it's also a very serious political issue. Yeah.
All right, well, I want to thank the three panelists for a really terrific discussion, and I hope the audience will join me in giving them a hand.